Alright, so following on from last week's episode on the film Universal Soldier, we are now going to jump to the next film in the Universal Soldier series, which is the second in the trilogy, or the fourth chronologically made if we're counting all the ones that have been disregarded.
Ho 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 ho! Delightfully devilish, Seymour.
Yes everybody, welcome back to Delightfully Devilish, the show where we discuss films that all at once meet the criteria of being the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm your host Jukebox Harry, and today we are looking at a sequel to Universal Soldier, which came out 17 years after the original as a direct-to-DVD movie. When you think of a direct-to-DVD sequel to an action film, particularly one that's come out 17 years after the original, you're not likely to think of something being held in high regard. But there is the rare example of a film that meets this criteria and manages to live up to the standard set by its predecessor, or exceed it if you've seen Undisputed 2. With Universal Soldier Regeneration, it's honestly pretty hard to say whether or not it transcends the standard set by the original film, but it definitely comes very close. But it does this by going in a fundamentally different direction to its predecessor. Universal Soldier Regeneration opens with a shootout at a gallery or something like that, with the assailants taking two people hostage. These people turn out to be the Ukrainian Prime Minister's kids, and this quickly turns into a car chase. And already there are some tells that this is a much lower budget film, primarily because the cinematography isn't as widescreen as the original, but nonetheless everything is captured pretty well. The film does use shaky cam from time to time, but it's used in moderation and never gets excessive. And the man in charge of the cinematography on this film is none other than Peter Hyams himself, director of 2010 and Time Cop, and Capricorn 1, which I previously touched upon. His son John Hyams is the director of this film, and I have a lot of positive things to say about him as a director. The terrorists have taken over Chernobyl and are keeping the hostages there as they demand the release of some imprisoned comrades. And one of the people working for the villains is an actual Universal Soldier, played by Belarusian MMA champion Andrei Arlovsky, also known as the Pitbull. We get a whole scene explaining what the Universal Soldier project was all about, which isn't all that necessary because we've already seen it before.
By freezing a human body with nitrogen-based gas, repairing it and reheating it through thyroid and pituitary augmentation, we were able to revive a recently deceased soldier.
Deceased? As in dead?
That's right.
Yes, that's what
Deceased.
means.
This is all aimed to set up an understanding that a second generation of Unisols were created, with the Unisol that's working with the terrorists being one of them. And already you can tell the plot is going to be way better than in the original Universal Soldier movie. The original Universal Soldier took its concept and turned it into a ridiculous road movie. Universal Soldier Regeneration instead decides to focus all its energy on one hostage rescue mission and everything that happens with that. That's a much better idea. And Jean-Claude Van Damme's character, Luc Devereaux, is undergoing rehabilitation to try and reintroduce him to society. A fair portion of Jean-Claude Van Damme's screen time in Universal Soldier Regeneration is focusing on having his character trying to reconnect with its humanity. As much as I respect this film for trying to give some meaning to the character and trying to challenge Jean-Claude Van Damme to actually act in the situations, that's not what we want from this movie. And to add to it, there's this weird scene where he randomly beats up a guy in a restaurant, and it honestly doesn't project a positive outlook for the action in this film, because the camera work shoots the actors way too close to capture what's going on with clarity, and the editing is so choppy that it's rather jarring. But I do remember being very impressed by the action both times I watched this film when I was younger, so I must have just forgotten about this scene, and that's probably a good thing. Basically, don't hold your breath for Jean-Claude Van Damme to start delivering the goods in this film until he picks up a gun, and you will be waiting a while for that. But trust me, just hang on. The disappointing fight scene we just had is immediately redeemed by a pretty solid action scene to follow it. The good guys lead a charge on Chernobyl, and things start off pretty well with them securing the first location, and then they send in the Unisols. But here comes the Pitbull. He enters with an impressively big jump before he smashes the absolute shit out of the first Unisol using his natural skills as an MMA fighter.
Holy shit, did you see that?
He quickly comes after the second one. Things are pretty intense when he approaches the third one, and after a quick scuffle, he impales the soldier on a hook. Every single time he goes up against a Unisol, I got completely engaged in the film. It was awesome. And then the fourth one comes along. I know that's a cliche, but this film is doing that with the best of intentions. This leads to a pretty badass punch-on. There are a few moments in this scene where the lighting can be a bit jarring, and sometimes the editing is a little too choppy, but most of the time it's a perfectly solid spectacle. The Pitbull pummels his foe to death before coming out of it and mowing down all the good guys, taking several hits in the process but barely flinching. Needing a miracle, the good guys decide to go and fetch Devereaux, who attempts to fend them off unsuccessfully. In between this scene and the next action scene, we have a lot of boring dialogue, which makes a half-assed attempt to try to put some characterization into the story, but it doesn't work. The dialogue isn't particularly bad or pretentious, it just isn't entertaining. And all the villains are really underdeveloped, so I don't really care why they're doing what they're doing, nor am I concerned with the Ukrainian Prime Minister's response to the crisis. This is the boring patch of the film because nothing great happens for 20 minutes, aside from a few brief moments of a soldier named Captain Burke sneaking his way into Chernobyl, just to try and keep the story moving. This is the low point of the narrative. If you cut about 10 or 20 minutes from this film, you'd speed things up and make it a much better flowing movie, but unfortunately that's not what happened. Things take an unexpected turn when the villain reveals that he has revived Andrew Scott. Apparently he's been cloned and upgraded. As difficult as this is to believe, Dolph Lundgren was objectively one of the greatest parts about the first Universal Soldier. I am so happy they brought him back for whatever reason. Things drag on for a few more minutes, but then he comes out and starts going apeshit on the commander of the terrorists. It quickly becomes clear that the guy who cloned Andrew Scott forgot that he was a fucking maniac.
You often think about humankind and its destiny. Yes or no? I'm gonna put my thumb through your eye, you little bitch!
Suddenly it seems like things are starting to get back into the swing of the story as Scott takes charge as the new central villain. So after 30 minutes of fucking around, which is unfortunately about a third of the film's running time, things finally pick up when Devereaux gets sent back in. He leads a one-man assault, taking out everyone in his path through gunshots, explosions, and car crashes. And this is the point in the film where John Hyams redeems himself. We've seen some great action up until this point, but from now onwards, this is where the director really shines. We then approach the most memorable shot in the film, a hallway slaughter scene which is designed to look like it was all done in one take. It might have actually all been done in one take, but I'm fairly certain I saw at least one cut in there. Nonetheless, it's done incredibly well, and this is a technique I love to see used in action films. The way the camera just moves through the building, sometimes capturing things with close intensity and at other times letting it all happen behind closed doors, it all works to convey a feeling of empty violence to the viewer. I don't mean empty in the sense that it's lacking any feeling, I mean that it keeps itself emotionally distant from the viewer instead of trying to use edits to dramatize things, and honestly, it uses this technique very effectively. Devereaux continues to push his way through the building, slaughtering everyone in his way with plenty of knife action. We even get this moment.
Jump, Deacon, jump! Suicide is badass.
That's gotta be a comedic moment, but the film plays it off like such a serious thing, and I just don't know why, but I love it. Amid all this chaos, Burke has successfully snuck into Chernobyl to ensure the safety of the Prime Minister's children, but midway through it he ends up crossing paths with the Pitbull, which leads to another punch-on where he proves that he can put up a pretty good fight. And after another solid fight scene, things conclude with an execution that almost seems inspired by John Carpenter's Halloween. Finally, Devereaux ends up crossing paths with Scott again, reuniting the two foes 17 years after they had their last fight, and it's a pretty spectacular battle. The fight scene makes a great use of its environment, having the characters fight their way through different rooms and getting thrown through walls and down the stairs. And it makes extensive use of both the physical prowess of the film's two stars and their extensive training as martial artists. A lot of action scenes in modern day films overcomplicate things with choppy editing and shaky cam, but seeing these two martial artist legends go back at it again and still kick plenty of ass really takes the audience back to the basics of a solid action film. Though at the same time, there is also a feeling that the fight finishes too quickly.
Wait a second.
Like I said, Dolph Lundgren was one of the best parts of Universal Soldier, so the fact that this film titillates us with his presence and then throws him away pretty fast is kind of disappointing. He's awesome the entire time he was on screen, but he should have been written into the story to have a bigger part. Devereaux pushes on and eventually finds the Pitbull. I can't say much about this fight scene that I haven't already said about the others, because then I'm just going to be rambling. But goddamn, it's some badass old-fashioned man-to-man combat. Universal Soldier Regeneration barely gives Jean-Claude Van Damme any dialogue with his character, opting instead to just use him as a weapon in the same way the government uses his character as a weapon. He exists solely to fight and to show off the skills that made him the muscles from Brussels, and he does that perfectly well. For a man who's made a lot of schlocky direct-to-DVD films between this film and his last cinematic release, Jean-Claude Van Damme has lost none of the talent that is inherent to him. We've seen him play straight action roles, comedic caricatures of himself, and even serious drama, but when it comes to being a straight-up action badass, there is no other way he can top it. And after an intense and extensive struggle, Devereaux finally manages to disable his enemy and pin the bomb on him. And after a shot which reveals that Burke is now being stored as a Universal Soldier with multiple clones of himself, we get the credits. Is Universal Soldier Regeneration a good film? Absolutely. Universal Soldier Regeneration has two letdowns. One of them is the pacing and the writing of the film. The story in the film fits perfectly. It's a simple hostage rescue mission which incorporates different Universal Soldiers into the story very well as a human character. But after starting off strong, things really lose their edge for the 30 minutes in the middle of the film where there's almost no action whatsoever. This is a direct-to-DVD action film, not some kind of Oscar-baiting drama. We do not want the characters to talk, we want them to die.
Do you expect me to talk?
No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die.
The other disappointing thing about Universal Soldier Regeneration is the lack of screen time given to the action veterans. Don't get me wrong, John Hyams' directorial work on this film is so good that if you swapped Lundgren and Van Damme for two different MMA stars, you would still have an awesome action film. But the fact that he cast them in the first place gives this film its major hook and its sense of nostalgia. But unfortunately, he doesn't really give enough screen time to either of them. The film spends an annoying amount of time trying to give some characterization of Luke Devereaux before finally turning him into an emotionless military weapon. But what's worse is how they treat Andrew Scott. I mean, when he comes into the film, he replaces all the human characters as the central villain of the story, yet his screen time is also non-existent. In Regeneration, they basically reduce him to being a glorified cameo. When he's on the screen, his performance is awesome and he kicks so much ass in his fight scenes. But the film wastes so much time on boring characters that we don't care about when it could have been spending that on Dolph Lundgren, the character we want to see more of. But despite all the problems with the film, Universal Soldier Regeneration succeeds entirely on the backbone of John Hyams as director. It's important to remember that Universal Soldier Regeneration is a direct-to-DVD action film meant solely to appeal to action junkies and fans of the first movie. And with those standards, what really impresses me about Universal Soldier Regeneration is the fact that it actually comes out as an above-average action thriller. Particularly considering that it's a sequel to a pretty middling science fiction action franchise. If you look at other good examples of direct-to-DVD action films such as Ninja Shadow of a Tear or Undisputed 2, typically you'll have really great action scenes and a lot of generic storytelling. This film has all that, but also more. There is a keen sense of style which really benefits this film, and you can tell that a lot of attention has been paid to giving some strong imagery to the movie. The setting uses some brilliant locations which make the story thoroughly convincing, and the grim color scheme makes it feel like everything is happening in some kind of post-apocalyptic wasteland. The synth-inspired musical score and use of silence helps to reinforce this feeling as well, giving everything a very eerie mood. John Hyams cites director John Carpenter as an influence on him with this film, and you can see it. The Pitbull's character is like a martial arts trained Michael Myers, picking off all the heroes without even flinching, and some of the imagery, as well as the synthesized soundtrack, really adds to that mood. John Hyams is very content to make his movie less of a traditional action movie and more of a science fiction slasher film, but he does incorporate some magnificent martial arts scenes into it, so the movie ends up being like a cross between Alien and The Raid.
That's a winning combination!
When comparing it to the original, Universal Soldier Regeneration is probably just as good as Universal Soldier, although for a lot of different reasons. Universal Soldier had Roland Emmerich's eye for imagery, an engaging antagonist, and a sense of humor which occasionally lightened the mood nicely enough. But its story was a waste of its concept. I always felt like Universal Soldier took the road trip route with its story because it was a far more affordable route than the more action-focused one. But Universal Soldier Regeneration only had a budget of $9 million and used a way simpler yet superior story. I mean, the concept of both heroes and villains using unisols against each other is a really exciting one. Imagine a sequel to RoboCop, where Peter Weller returns and the character ends up getting captured by the villains and reprogrammed to do their bidding and take it out on the citizens of society. That's basically the idea behind Universal Soldier Regeneration, and it's a great one. Regeneration has a much bigger focus on martial arts than the original, and it brings elements of horror into it, which brings a lot of new life to the franchise. The film is a testament to the great talents of the director, the work of its two action veterans, as well as newcomers Andrei Arlovsky and Mike Pyle. Universal Soldier Regeneration gets 6 mega jumps out of 10. It's a film which has a lot of simplicity to it, which means there's a lot of boring dialogue sequences that don't really add anything. But it also allows a lot of room for John Hyams to make a very fine directorial debut, where he shows his talent at building atmosphere, great imagery, and very exciting action scenes. And that does it for today's episode of Delightfully Devilish, you guys. If you would like to see more episodes on this show, please hit that subscribe button. If there's any ideas for movies you want me to discuss on this show, please leave them in the comment section below. Otherwise, until next time, I've been your host, Jukebox Harry. Peace.